Lisboa, Bruxelles, Warszawa.
This podcast has been produced in cooperation with Euronet Plus, the leading radio network for EU news.
Hello and welcome to The Europeans, the podcast where two friends attempt to unravel the glorious mess that is Europe.
Oh, that's a nice description of what we do.
It is, isn't it? I'm Dominic Kramer, I'm in Amsterdam, and that's Katie Lee in Paris down the line. Hi, Katie.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm fine, although I don't like that we're now filming ourselves. We're doing that thing that all podcasters now have to do, apparently, which is film your recording.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I liked podcasting is because no one had to look at me.
Because we have faces for radio, as they say in the biz.
Speak for yourself.
I should say you've got a very nice face. I actually put perfume on for this recording, which makes no sense. Unless it's a Smellovision. Is that a thing yet?
Not yet, sadly. It's funny that that's the thing that we thought was going to happen. When in the 90s, that's the technological thing that's going to happen.
It still will.
Smellovision.
I have faith.
I have faith too. Anyway, Katie, how are you? Because there was some quite momentous news in a mini episode that dropped a few days ago. You're pregnant.
I am. I'm having baby number 2. Another little Frenchman. Very exciting.
And how are you feeling?
Heavy and also to some extent regretting this decision because I have a really active baby who was awake at 5 o'clock this morning. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, what am I going to do when there's 2 of them? Under the age of 2, there's going to be a 22-month gap between these 2 babies. So if anyone listening to this has been through that and would like to email me some advice, I am very welcoming of that advice. But I took baby number 1 to his first feminist protest this weekend for International Women's Day, which was very fun.
Oh, cute.
He did seem to be more interested in trying to eat stuff off the floor than chanting against the patriarchy. But small steps.
In his own way, in his own logic, that was probably what he wanted to do for the women of the world. Eat off the floor.
That's it.
Anyway, we should probably move on and talk about what's happening in the show this week.
Yeah, what's coming up?
Well, as our regular listeners probably know, we often try to look at the news from a slightly different angle to how people are receiving it from other news sources. So this week we are going to be looking at Russia, but not from the viewpoint you might expect from a podcast called The Europeans. We're going to be calling up Beverly Ochieng, a super smart security analyst based in Senegal, to find out what Russia has been doing in Africa over the past few years. It's a fascinating conversation and it's a huge story that hasn't been getting the attention it deserves in the European media. So keep listening to hear that chat later on in the show. But first, of course, it's time for Good Week, Bad Week.
Good week, bad week.
Who has had a bad week, Katie?
Yeah, well, this is the part of this week's show that is brought to you in collaboration with radio stations across Europe as part of our new partnership with Euronet Plus. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out the little announcement episode that dropped on our feed on Tuesday. But very briefly, the podcast really isn't changing much, but one of our segments every week is going to be part of this new collaboration with radio stations across the EU. And very excited about it we are too. Why this specific segment this week? Well, I wanted to talk about EU-wide tech policy and whether or not we should be using it to create the next Meta or Amazon or other evil giant tech company of your choice, because I am giving my bad week this week to a European tech product that was once a household name, Skype. I don't know if you've seen the news, Dominic, but the owner of Skype, Microsoft, has announced that it is killing off this once iconic internet telephone service. As of May the 5th, Skype will be no more. You must be very sad.
I am very sad. I mean, I haven't been using it for years, honestly. So, maybe it's just a bit of nostalgia that I'm feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it does raise the question of what we're going to do about the noise that we play before the interviews on this podcast. Because since the very beginning, we have used the Skype ringtone to signal that we're about to speak to a guest. Some people love it, some people hate it. During this mourning period for Skype, I read a quite beautiful tribute to the Skype ringtone by Michael Frischkopf, who is the director of the Canadian Centre for Ethnomusicology. And he points out that the Skype ringtone isn't really in either a major or a minor key. It's kind of both/neither. He told The Guardian it could sound happy or sad, which could represent the sadness of longing for someone and the joy of connecting with them.
That's weird. I don't know if I agree with him. I think the harmony implies a major key.
I think it implies minor. That's so interesting. This is like the dress that some people saw as gold and some people saw as blue. It's very obviously minor to me. Anyway, I thought that was a really unexpectedly poignant tribute. Full disclosure, it has been many years since we actually rang a guest on Skype. We have been using, like most of the world, other internet calling services, but we did keep the noise as a kind of retro tribute to the early days of the show. And personally, I'd be quite sad to see it go, even though quite a lot of our listeners would be, quite frankly, delighted, I think. For years, we've been getting emails from people saying, please get rid of the Skype noise. I hate it with a passion. Maybe now's the time to say goodbye.
If the Skype noise goes, I go.
Oh, wow. Okay. Big policy.
Well, no, I would be sad to see it go as well. And I think the fact that it's disappearing makes me feel even more inclined to keep it, just as a kind of retro throwback to our early days and to show how old this podcast is. But back to the serious news, because that is what this segment is, a serious news segment.
Sure.
Back to the closing down of Skype. Just to clarify, you've been describing Skype as a European tech product, but you also said it's owned by Microsoft. What makes it European?
I am describing Skype as European because it was invented in Europe. It was created by a group of tech bros, I guess you could say, from several countries, actually. Two of them from Estonia, one of them Danish, and one of them Swedish. Several of these programmers were also involved in bringing the world one of the earliest file-sharing programs, Kazaa, which might sound familiar if you too were a teenager interested in illegally downloading music in the early noughties.
Of course I wasn't.
Of course you weren't. Angel Child's Dominic Kramer. Anyway, Skype was founded in 2003 and quickly became the world's most popular program for calling people without using a phone. For free. You could hear your friend and see them on your computer screen through the magic of the internet, which is obviously something that many of us do every day these days. But back in 2003, when the world was still familiar with expensive long-distance phone calls, Skype was kind of revolutionary. It was a game changer for being able to have a long-distance relationship or talking to your relatives in a different country or whatever. And it also became kind of culturally important. Like there was a while where Oprah Winfrey would Skype people on her chat show. About 300 million people were using Skype at its peak. And obviously, at the same time, it became a huge, huge business. eBay bought Skype in 2005 for $2.6 billion.
Whoa.
And the company changed hands a few times in the following years, culminating in Microsoft buying it in 2011 for a whopping $8.5 billion. At the time, it was the most money Microsoft had ever spent buying anything. But Skype kept its headquarters in Luxembourg, resolutely European. It may or may not have something to do with the fact that Luxembourg is a rather tax-friendly location for hosting your giant tech company. And Skype continued to have a lot of its staff in Europe, in Estonia and Sweden, London and Berlin, despite, being owned by a US company, Microsoft.
But presumably the reason it's being shut down is that most people have just stopped using Skype in recent years and moved on to Zoom and other programs.
Indeed. That's a big part of the reason. It went from having 300 million users to around 23 million by 2020. One of the things that had made Skype different was that you could pay for credits that would allow you to ring a telephone from a computer. But these days, that's probably only useful for calling like a particularly tech-phobic grandparent who only has a landline phone or something like that. Because obviously a bunch of other platforms for calling people online have become available in recent years. Zoom, of course, emerged out of the pandemic as the queen of all the video call apps. And there are also plenty of competitors that were more consciously designed for use on our phones than Skype, like WhatsApp and FaceTime. A lot of these apps were also better at handling group calls than Skype was. Another part of the story, though, is that Microsoft bought Skype and then mysteriously kind of abandoned it. Like, they didn't really invest in keeping it relevant as a service. There were mounting complaints that it was buggy and didn't work properly. And in recent years especially, Microsoft have been focusing their efforts on developing Microsoft Teams, which is their main product aimed at rivaling Zoom as like the app of choice for remote work meetings. And indeed, that is the justification for shutting down Skype. Microsoft is basically like, Teams can do everything that Skype does and more. I will say that I absolutely hate Microsoft Teams.
So do I.
It's terrible. I don't think I've ever been able to straightforwardly join a Teams call without something going wrong. But it is certainly able to do stuff that Skype couldn't do well. Stuff like integrating with people's online calendars.
Although, honestly, Katie, I don't know if we've ever had a Zoom call together that hasn't required like 10 different attempts of each of us logging in.
Very true. Why is Zoom the world's most popular video call app? It just doesn't make sense. It's not very good. Please don't so assume.
It's just your opinion.
Indeed.
It's funny, it's kind of difficult to think of that many tech brands that we use on a daily basis these days that actually come from Europe. I mean, Spotify is one of the only examples.
I mean, Spotify is still sort of Swedish in that the two biggest shareholders are still the two Swedes who created it, Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzon. But they only own about a quarter of the shares. The rest are mostly held by big investment companies, a lot of which are based in the good old US of A. So even Spotify can't really be held up these days as a great example of a European tech innovation that has stayed truly European. And over the last couple of decades, really, as we've watched the world get taken over by the likes of Meta and Amazon, a lot of people have asked the question of why there isn't a European company among these super dominant global companies. I mean, a lot of other people have also asked if that's something that we really want, given that none of these companies is held up as being uncontroversially a force for good in the world. But at the same time, it's worth asking, right? You know, like, this is a rich continent with a really educated workforce. We do make a lot of tech stuff that isn't a household name, like, I don't know, specialist medical equipment or whatever. And in general, we have plenty of startups, but they just never seem to get that big. Why isn't there a European answer to Meta or Amazon? Just to give you some sense of the difference in scale that we're talking about between the size of the US tech industry and the size of the EU one, last year, according to Euronews, the total values of the shares of the top 7 tech companies in the EU was only about a 20th of the same figure for the top 7 US tech companies. So that is a huge difference. Our tech industry is teeny tiny compared to America's. And there have been various arguments put forward over the years as to why one of the biggest, baddest tech companies isn't European. One of them is that we have too many languages and legal systems, so that makes it hard to scale a tech company up in the same way that you're able to do in a mostly monolingual country like the US. Another is this theory that the reason that Silicon Valley flourished as a place where giant tech companies could be born is that local laws several decades ago made it easy for people to create businesses that then failed without them necessarily facing disastrous financial consequences. And that encouraged early pioneers, people like Steve Jobs, to take risks and innovate there in a way that would just be more financially costly here in Europe. And once those companies got big, various things about the US system just continued to allow them to concentrate power. So, like, why did Skype get bought by eBay and later Microsoft? Maybe it's just because the US system allowed those companies to become massive in the first place and have the money to buy Skype in a way that would have been harder in Europe. A third argument is that there's just way more venture capital investment money in the US, about 20 times as much venture capital money, in fact, and that this cash mostly gets invested at home in the US because, you know, it's easier for investors. They know what they're dealing with. And then there is, of course, perhaps the most popular argument, regulation.
That old chestnut.
An old chestnut. And there have been years of passionate debate about whether the weight of regulation in Europe makes it too hard to innovate here. Like, is it too hard to set up a business here in general, even on a national level, given all of the admin in lots of European countries, let alone on an EU level? Does the EU make it too hard to copyright an invention? Is there too much privacy regulation?
Yeah, well, a team of Republicans in the US definitely think so, don't they?
Apparently.
And actually, they seem to be particularly angry right now about a couple of fairly new but big EU internet laws that affect big US tech companies like Elon Musk's, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two massive pieces of tech-related regulation that came into force across the EU in 2022. They're called the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and the Digital Services Act, or DSA. The DMA is largely aimed at stopping giant tech companies from abusing their power. And the DSA is mostly aimed at preventing misinformation and harmful content on the internet. So both very much aimed at protecting us, everyday internet users, much more than they protect the billionaire owners of platforms like Meta. And indeed, EU competition regulators have fined companies like Apple and Google billions of euros for abuses of market power. And Meta and X are both under investigation for failing to protect European internet users from online harm. So you can see why Musk et al. Don't really like our regulators. And this tension over all of the billions of dollars of fines and the investigations, that is something that has really been contributing to transatlantic tensions in recent weeks, along with the absolute car crash that was Trump's press conference with Zelensky and the US suspension of aid to Ukraine, and about 50 other things that feel like they've happened in the space of about 5 minutes. Trump has described the EU fines against Google and others as, quote, overseas extortion, which EU officials have hit back against. You know, they've said, all we are doing is enforcing our laws. And we're not specifically targeting US companies in doing that. It just so happens that the world's largest tech companies are American. And if they've been misbehaving, we have a duty to make sure that they follow the rules that we've set. They've also pointed out that ByteDance, which owns TikTok, is also under investigation. And that's a Chinese company. So, you know, it's not just US companies being targeted. All the same, you know, things are really volatile right now. And the fact that a tech oligarch named Elon Musk appears to be making disturbingly large decisions for the US government right now, that makes it more likely that American anger at the way that we regulate tech companies over here, that can end up being a major justification for the Trump administration whacking big tariffs on European exports and basically saying, well, if you didn't want these tariffs, you shouldn't have gone after our Googles and our Metas.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that a lot of these fines are against US companies also just makes you realize quite how dependent we are on US tech at a time when being dependent on anything from the US maybe isn't such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of anxious talk over the last couple of weeks about how dependent we Europeans are on US defense and how we need to not rely on the US to protect ourselves from Russia now that the US can't really be seen as a reliable friend on that front. And we're no doubt going to come back to the EU's 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe because it is a huge deal that needs unpicking. But yeah, there is also a growing conversation about how dependent we are on US technology and whether that might be dangerous in this more uncertain world that we find ourselves in. And I'm not talking about the kind of household name technology that, you know, we use every day, you know, the fact that we all buy a ton of stuff from Amazon or whatever. It's the less visible, more nerdy stuff, like the fact that a huge amount of European data is stored on the cloud via US companies. So there's been a lot more talk of late about tech sovereignty and how we need to strengthen our own artificial intelligence companies, our own data storage companies, our own microchip companies. All of these things are crucial to running the tech that we are so dependent on. Do we really want to be reliant on companies from the US or indeed other parts of the world, like in Asia, for all of this stuff, given that we're not sure where the world is going right now? Interestingly, in December, the European Commission appointed its first ever technological sovereignty chief, Henna Vilkkunen. She's from Finland. And there has also in recent weeks been a lot of talk about boosting AI in Europe. The European Commission announced this plan at the end of last year to invest 750 million euros in 7 different places across Europe for training supercomputers. These are these insanely powerful computers which can train the models that AI runs on. That seemed quite impressive at the time, but then the US casually announced that it was going to invest $500 billion in AI. Which made our 750 million euros look a little bit puny. So Ursula von der Leyen launched a new plan to try to raise 200 billion euros of investment for AI.
Okay.
A lot of which would presumably need to come from the private sector. So stuff is happening on this front. I feel like I've wandered quite far from Skype and the demise of its amazing ringtone.
Everything comes back to European defense and what Elon Musk is doing.
Yeah, there's one topic in town at the moment, unfortunately. I've wandered quite far from Skype, but I am going to wrap up by coming back to it because I feel like Skype is a symbol of something that we've seen repeatedly in recent decades, which is a great tech company that's been created in Europe. And then it gets bought by a US company because that's where the money is. And then we've both lost control of it and it has been left to languish. And that is kind of annoying from like a European pride point of view, right? But is it a bigger problem than that? And arguably it is. Not so much because the world won't survive without Skype, because of course there are a gazillion competitors. And it's also not necessarily sad that Skype didn't end up becoming this huge Amazon-style company that we could be proud of as a European export. It's a problem because of what it represents, this loss of control over a technological innovation in a world where having control of tech might end up being pretty crucial. So I do think this growing conversation about tech sovereignty is important. But it's not so much about having gargantuan household name companies like Google and Apple coming out of Europe. There's an apparently excellent book, which I'm afraid I haven't been able to read yet, but lots and lots of people recommend it. It's by Anu Bradford, and it's called The Brussels Effect. And it basically argues that even if our tech industry isn't that huge, the EU is having an outsized impact on the way that tech gets regulated worldwide. Because in a lot of cases, the way that we're designing bits of legislation like the DMA means that if companies have to comply here in Europe, it's easiest for them to just comply everywhere. Like in some cases, that's the only option, the only thing they can do. And that is powerful and probably a force for good in the world, since these laws are aimed at protecting ordinary internet users against bad behavior by giant companies. And maybe that is a more important kind of influence than being the home of the biggest, baddest tech companies in the world. Having said that, Ursula von der Leyen has said that she thinks we should launch a quote-unquote Buy European campaign when it comes to all of these new weapons that we're going to be buying. And we should be prioritizing buying stuff from European defense companies, providing that they can produce all of these guns and ammo and tanks fast enough.
Yeah, although just have to fact check that. I saw a really good thread on Blue Sky from Stanley Pignal pointing out that she quotes this statistic that 80% of weapons in Europe are bought from the US, and actually it seems to have been really badly sourced. And it's nothing like that. So Ursula, get your facts right.
We will be putting a link to that thread in the show notes. Thanks, Stanley. But anyway, if we do this Buy European thing, maybe the same should apply to tech, and we should be trying to use European tech companies when we can, like both to build up their businesses, because it's a nice thing to do, but also to exercise our strategic independence, even if it's as tiny little individual internet users.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that we hate Zoom and you also hate Teams. And actually, we recently switched to a nice European website called Jitsi.
Oh, is it Jitsi? I've been saying Jitsi.
I don't know. Anyway, it's a free open source video conferencing piece of software. I think it was made by a student in France.
Yeah.
It's a Bulgarian guy, I think.
He was a Bulgarian student called Emil Ivov. He created it back in 2003 when he was an Erasmus student, actually, studying in Strasbourg in France. Apparently, he was also teaching swing dancing at the time.
Cute.
Busy guy. And it's really, really good. It's at least as good as Zoom, and hardly anyone seems to have heard of it. It's open source. source, as you say, which means that anyone can take the code and use it to develop new cool things, which is pretty cool. So yeah, heartily recommend Jitsi or Yitzi or whatever it's supposed to be called. On which note, I want to end this by drawing your attention to a great website that has been sent to us a few times in recent weeks, especially, which is the European Alternatives website. And you can use this website to find good alternative products to all of those tech things from the USA that you are so horribly addicted to. Your search engines and your email services, places to register a website address, even all kinds of stuff. You can find some really great European companies on there. And so you should definitely check it out. It is at european-alternatives.eu.
I'll check it out.
Who has had a good week, Dominic?
Well, I'm going to be totally transparent here and say that I was planning on giving Romania's mainstream politicians a qualified good week because the Romanian electoral authorities announced they were banning the pro-Russian far-right candidate Călin Georgescu from the rerun of last November's presidential election that you may remember was cancelled due to allegations of Russian interference. But then I realized we're recording just before the Constitutional Court decides whether or not to uphold this ban of Georgescu, and therefore it would be immediately out of date. So it's a topic we're going to have to come back to another week. And instead, I'm making a handbrake turn and I'm going to discuss the Eurovision Song Contest.
Nice.
I feel like it's what we all need this week.
I think so.
I'm giving good week to defenders of clean language after the European Broadcasting Union told Malta that it had to change the lyrics and title of its Eurovision entry because it contains the C word.
Oh, wow.
Well, it almost contains the C word. The song actually contains a K word, cunt, which is the Maltese word for singing.
Do we need to tick the strong language box on this episode?
Definitely not. It's a Maltese word for singing. Shall we have a quick listen to the track in question before it's been reworked? It's sung by Malta's Eurovision entrant Mirjana Conte.
Serving cunt. Serving cunt.
That's enough, I think.
Oh, wow.
Honestly, I don't really know where to start with this. I have so much to say.
Well, I mean, it might be sort of obvious, but why don't you start by telling us how the EBU have justified banning the lyrics of this song?
Okay, yeah. Well, for those of you who aren't total Eurovision nerds, I should probably say who the EBU are. They're the European Broadcasting Union, which is an organisation made up of public broadcasters from across and beyond Europe. And yes, the EBU sets the rules for Eurovision. The EBU's own restrictions for language in song entries are pretty broad. They say that they prohibit swearing or any other language that is unacceptable, illegal, unethical, offensive, obscene, defamatory, or deemed inappropriate for the Eurovision Song Contest, or otherwise offensive to public morals or decency. It covers quite a lot. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it was the EBU who contacted Malta last week to announce that they decided that serving cunt was not acceptable and the lyrics would need to be changed before the deadline for submissions of songs, which was in 6 days' time of the notice they received. Mirjana Conte, the artist, posted a statement on Facebook saying that she was shocked and disappointed by the decision, but that the show will go on.
I mean, is it normal for them to give like a 6-day deadline for the whole words and the chorus of a song to change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, but it doesn't really feel fair on the Maltese entry that they only had 6 days to come up with an alternative, seeing as the song's been out for quite a while now.
Yeah.
And the Times of Malta claim that the EBU made this last-minute decision to intervene after the BBC, the UK member of the EBU, made a complaint to the EBU about the lyrics. Now, I should say that the BBC haven't commented on whether or not they were indeed behind the complaint, but if it was them, they would probably have reported the song because the British Broadcasting Regulatory Body, an organisation called Ofcom, have pretty clear rules about which words can and can't be used on TV and at what time of day. The C word is considered very strong language in research done by Ofcom. So it's only allowed to be heard on TV or radio after the watershed, which is 9 p.m. And even then, it should be used with caution.
Okay, so we could call this a good week for respectable use of language. But I mean, poor Mariana, she wasn't even using the C word. Fine, if you are watching this on British television and you have a native English-speaking ear, you might hear that. But that's not what she's saying. She's saying not the C word, it's a K word, a Maltese K word. So this is censorship.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. And that argument is certainly being made in Malta. And it's maybe striking that the one Maltese word in the song has been banned. The culture minister of Malta actually put out a statement saying that the EBU's decision represented blatant censorship of the Maltese language. And the singer, Mariana, actually appeared on BBC's Newsnight and said that serving cunt is about serving singing. I guess that's why she sings like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, serving cunt. It kind of is there in the lyrics. Anyway, the culture minister has also said that the Maltese public broadcaster is exploring legal action against the EBU to challenge the decision in the Swiss courts. And look, I am sympathetic to Mariana and Malta, and it is unfortunate that the one Maltese word is the problem word. But on the other hand, serving cunt is clearly deliberately a play on words. It's not a mistake that it sounds like the C word. That is the point of the lyrics and the song title. It was a song like surely designed to be controversial. So to claim now that it's discriminating against the Maltese language feels a little bit rich to me.
Because just to clarify, serving C word, that is a phrase amongst the young people and in like queer culture and stuff, right?
Yeah. Good point. We should probably discuss the etymology of the phrase serving C word. Well, let's first start with the C word, which is a kind of vulgar word for the vulva. And there's some confusion about the etymology of that word. It's probably of Germanic origin, and it is used in subtly different ways in the English-speaking world. Apparently, actually, in Australia, it's not so offensive as a word.
It's a regular greeting.
Yeah. Yeah, apparently you can use it positively as well. But in other parts of the world, it's considered one of the most taboo words in the English language, largely due to historically misogynistic use of the word. But over the past 15 years or so, the word has begun to be reclaimed, particularly by LGBTQ plus people. In the ballroom scene and around drag culture, the phrase serving C word is seen by many as the opposite of misogynistic. It's actually a celebration of women and a celebration of femininity. So you could argue that the British Broadcasting Regulator needs to get with the times and realise that it's not as offensive of a word as it used to be, at least not in this context.
Okay, fine, but you have given this good week. So are you siding, Dominic, with the language police here?
No, because as I've said before, good week is not a value judgment. I'm not siding with anyone. I'm just saying that it's been a good week for the people who want to protect, quote unquote, respectable language.
Nice cop-out clause.
I have to say that when I first saw that the song had come out, and I hadn't heard the song, but I just read the title and saw that there was some fuss online, I had hoped against hope that it was actually going to be a song about Immanuel Kant, the German Enlightenment philosopher, but sadly that wasn't the case.
That might be a Eurovision first. Do we know yet, do we have any idea how Mariana is going to change the song so that it fits within the rules? Because there's a pretty crucial line here that we're talking about.
Yeah, and the title of the piece. Well, she will have submitted it by now because Monday was the deadline, final deadline for Eurovision song submissions. But at the time of recording, it hasn't been released, the updated song with cleaner lyrics. But there is a report in the Times of Malta suggesting that the song will be changed to Serving Conte, which is singer Mariana's surname, which I think is actually quite brilliant.
But also, as a French person listening to that, you're going to hear Serving Comte, which is a cheese. Which is delicious.
I love that. Also, another great thing about the apparent plan is the article goes on to say that parts of the song containing the K word will likely be left without a lyrical replacement and a sound might be included instead. And I thought we could ask our listeners what sound they would suggest. I was thinking maybe your clown nose noise. You remember? That you do?
Rahoo, rahoo.
Yeah, serving.
Rahoo, rahoo.
I love it.
Miriana's going to win with that one.
Anyway, if they do this, clearly the whole audience are going to be shouting the C word or K word anyway when it comes to the live shows. So that'll be the next challenge on their hand. Can they dampen the sound of the audience shouting the C word? Well, they managed to drown the sound of booing for the Israeli entrant last year. So I think they have that technology available to them. Anyway, yeah, this is my good week, and it's not maybe very important, but it's also why I love Eurovision, because everything is just so rubbish in the world right now, like literally everything. And we need, or at least I need, the joy of a news story like this one. And it's all thanks to this completely bonkers song competition that I love, despite it being controversial, and sometimes there are incredibly serious news stories around it. But yeah, forgive me for not talking about the Romanian presidential election or other alarming news reports around Europe, like what's going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But we will come back to all those very important things in the future. But for now, yeah, good week for clean language at the Eurovision Song Contest.
We are endlessly grateful to those of you listeners who keep this independent podcast in business by supporting us on Patreon. So a huge, huge thank you to all of you, and special thanks to our latest supporters, who are Valerio, Lisa, Mary Jane, Natalie, HY, someone called Preppy Prince.
Good name.
And Ammo.
Supporting us on Patreon is one of the best things you could possibly do to make sure we can continue being able to make these episodes. Another thing you could do, if you're not in a position to support us financially, is tell your friends about us. Frankly, even just like telling 2 friends about us this week would be incredible. Send them a message on Signal or Instagram or, I don't know, an email. I don't care how you do it, but I do care that you do it. And actually, it feels even more necessary than usual this week because we've discovered something a bit concerning, thanks to listeners who listen to us on Spotify, that our podcast episodes have stopped automatically appearing on the Spotify feed of many of our listeners, even when we drop a new episode.
So weird and annoying.
Yeah, I think maybe they've changed the algorithm or the formatting of the homepage. Anyway, we're trying to look into why this is, and if anyone has any ideas, please let us know, because it could have quite potentially devastating effects for our listener numbers. But in the meantime, it's just another reason why we need your help with growing our listenership by telling your friends, your families, your colleagues, and even your frenemies. We're not choosy about this show.
Mwahaha. Every so often, some obscure headline catches my eye about Russia doing something or other in Africa, like providing some tanks to this country, hosting the leader of that country. Most recently, it was about Putin signing some new deal with the Central African Republic. And there are so many things going on in the world right now that this relatively low-key campaign of Russia's to win influence in Africa and also involve itself militarily, it's not exactly been on the front pages, but it is really interesting and I think underreported. Like, what exactly is Russia up to? And why is Russia doing all of this at a time when it's already waging an expensive and devastating war on Ukraine? There is a lot to unravel here, and we have the perfect person to help us get to grips with it all. Beverly Ochieng is an analyst who specializes in exactly this question of what the hell Russia is up to in Africa. She's originally from Kenya, but these days she is based in Dakar in Senegal, which makes sense because a lot of this Russian meddling is going on in the mostly French-speaking bit of Africa, the Sahel region, this insanely huge stretch of Western, North-ish Africa, running from Mauritania in the west to Chad in the east. Most of these countries are former French colonies. Honestly, we had so much to talk about with Beverly that we are definitely not going to be able to squeeze it all into this podcast, which is why if you go to our YouTube channel, you will find a much longer version of our conversation, which really digs deep into all of these murky goings on. I really recommend you check out that video. We are at youtube.com/at Europeans Podcast. You do need that little at symbol there. For some reason, I don't understand YouTube. But for now, here's the shorter version, a great conversation with Beverly Ochieng. Beverly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the program.
So for several years now, we've been getting this kind of drip of news reports about Russia building up its military presence in Africa, usually through this shadowy private security company, the Wagner Group, which for about a year now has operated under a new name, Africa Corps. Can you start by giving us an overview of how long Russia has been getting involved in conflict situations in Africa, what exactly it's been doing, and where it's been doing it?
Russia has been in the region since post-independence, so they were very integral to supporting independent movements as well as governments that were emerging after they had shown off colonialism. And then now more contemporary Russian involvement has involved defense and military operations, particularly through the Wagner Group and now the Africa Corps. Core countries where they are is Sudan, mostly the Western region, which is being currently run by a paramilitary force because it's at war. They have been in the Central African Republic over the north and the eastern regions where there are rebel forces there at the behest of the government. They are in Mali, where they have been involved in active operations in the northern region, but also in the central and parts of the west and south. A few other forces were sent to Niger and Burkina Faso, primarily to be training security forces, but also giving regime protection. These are all countries that are active war zones. They are facing rebels or militants or even just interfighting between armies. So they are not just providing military support in the front line, but also training and protecting the leaders of those countries because they're the ones who have requested Russian presence to that scale.
So you mentioned the operation in the Central African Republic, and that was launched back in 2018. And I believe it's kind of held up as a bit of a model of how Russia operates in Africa. Why is it seen as a model, and how is it supposed to really work?
Well, initially, Central African Republic requested the UN Security Council for stabilization support, and Russia was one of the first to put its hand up and say they would be able to provide military aid and other forms of aid, diplomatic support for them to stabilize after civil war. Now, what happened is initially there were military instructors who were sent to the countries with handfuls of handheld guns, which were supposed to be used to train the local army so that they could fight rebel forces that had been undermining the government's presence in the northern and eastern regions. But then over time, it diversified beyond just military support. It was military support in exchange for mineral concessions. The Wagner Group over the years established economic networks and companies through which they could then use as a front to be able to trade minerals. It moved on to timber, sometimes even cattle. There was also a very robust media and disinformation campaign. A lot of it targeted Central African Republic's Western partners, primarily France, which had a fairly poor record over allegations of sexual assault by some of its forces. So they capitalized on that to try to fuel anger and discontent against the West. So they were operating with the government, sometimes with even the ruling party youths in the CAR. They were providing close protection to not just the president, but also key government infrastructure. There were instances where they were involved in customs and regulating customs as a way of generating revenue. And that became a model for Russian paramilitary involvement such that they became a self-sustaining force. Of course, they had a central command, which was in Russia, a member who was very close to the Kremlin, but not really a government official. His name was Yevgeny Prigozhin. And because of this sort of semi-autonomous way of operating, they built a robust empire where they were able to consolidate funds, to purchase equipment, to be able to still get support from the Russian Defense Ministry. And for a long time, Russia officially denied this. But if you look at that, economy, diplomatic, military, and then you also have a media campaign which allows you to gain public resonance, it meant that Russia and even the Wagner Group had a much wider resonance beyond the CAR such that they were able to influence some of their deployments in the Sahel.
I mean, you mentioned minerals, access to very lucrative minerals. You also mentioned propaganda against rival countries. How much do we know about what Russia sees as in it for them in Africa? Why are they doing this? Is it primarily about the economy? Is it primarily about sort of strategic, diplomatic games that they have going on? What's the goal here?
I mean, for a long time, it often felt like Russia was trying to distance itself from some of the operations by the Wagner campaigners, including Prigozhin himself. But Prigozhin used to state often that he was doing it for Russia to be able to have a strong foothold in the region at a time when it was losing its credibility, considering the actions in Crimea much earlier and then later on the war in Ukraine. It was a way for Russia to also demonstrate that it is a geopolitical partner that can compete with the West in a region where France, the EU, the US has had so much economic, military, and diplomatic influence. But if you really think about it, Russia has not been able to provide as much aid, for instance, as say the US to the region or even the EU, which continue to be the leading aid partners despite, strategic realignments around that. Russia would mostly posture, and the Wagner Group was very good at posturing this. They would tease out campaigns whereby they would demonstrate that France was, for instance, a rat that was eating the resources of Sahel countries, and a Wagner mercenary comes in and beats up this rat and is seen to be saving the people of the Sahel from something that is taking advantage of their resources. And this played up so much that it did disrupt Western presence, and it did make the West feel like it was losing a foothold, even though there was still some resonance towards the West being here. Russian campaigns mostly capitalize on existing sentiment against the West rather than propelling or being the ones that are creating that sentiment. And that's part of the underlying success. It's very easy to co-opt that and make it have public messaging. This is also an age where social media is growing in the region. It doesn't have as much reach because if you think about how much internet electricity there is versus how many people are able to actually access it, it's disproportionately urban. It's disproportionately aligned with some of the growing military political class. But it did have an impact on dislodging some Western presence and raising those grievances against the West and allowing Russia to then establish itself as a military and diplomatic partner in the region.
Almost all reports about Russia's influence in Africa mention that the core of their tactic is, quote unquote, filling the void. Could you explain what that void is and why it occurs?
Between 2020 up until now, there have been a series of military coups starting off in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and a few other countries. These coups were triggered initially by political mismanagement, but also a very heightened sense of insecurity. These are countries that are with active Al-Qaeda, Islamic State militants, and other rebel groups that are operating. In 2013 and 2012, France brought in thousands of troops to try and roll back the insurgency. They were deployed initially in northern Mali. They were able to pull back the militant forces and allow the army to secure territory. But over the years, this insurgency has spread. So from northern Mali towards the central region, by 2017, the Al-Qaeda group had become quite a big alliance involving other active armed groups in the central region of Mali. By 2015, the insurgency had spread into Burkina Faso and Niger. The force by France increased to a 5,000-strong force, which was now spread across the region all the way up until Chad. The core mission of the Sahel mission was to be able to counter militant violence. And this was seen as having failed. So by the time the coups were taking place, these military governments were now aligning their sentiment with the public to say that French forces and other Western forces, including the UN, the EU Takuba force, should leave. And they did leave eventually, including the US in 2024 September. Now, Russian paramilitaries were invited because people had seen their apparent prowess in the Central African Republic just before the 2020 election. They pushed back rebels, an election was held, President Touadéra was re-elected. People felt that this is the kind of force that was needed in the Sahel to be able to fight back militants. But there were not as many. In Mali, there are just about 2,000, which is half of the number of French forces. The G5 Sahel was another localized force being supported by France. It collapsed. There were 5,000 others. The UN had about 13,000 personnel, primarily in Mali. That was also forced to leave. So Russia does say that it is filling that void, but in terms of capacity, it is much less, even with the training and the kind of equipment that they have been sending to the Sahel in recent years.
I mean, when we zoom out, Beverly, and look at how Russia is doing generally in Africa right now, do you see it as broadly being successful in its African operations right now, or are there signs that it is maybe overstretched? I mean, especially at a time when it's already, of course, fighting another very, very expensive, complicated war in Ukraine.
By and large, I think Russia has won in some narrative wars, especially when you look at the Twitter accounts of some of its embassies across the region. I think the most active are the Kenyan and the South African. They really sort of do a good job at rattling other embassies. I think there was one time the South African one was engaging with the German South African embassy, and it felt like a war of words. It was a very strange thing to see, but it's a very, very, 21st century type of spat taking place on social media. In terms of being able to upset Western presence, I think Russia would see that as quite a success. When the Ukraine war broke out, people were lobbying African countries to support the resolution. Quite a number of them abstained. Everyone forgot about the countries that voted in favor, which were an overwhelming 20 or so. Everyone focused on the abstentions, which demonstrates how much there's so much geopolitical contestation within the region. And where the West is using its foothold, it's not just Russia that's capitalizing. It's, Turkey, it's China, it's the United Arab Emirates. They are becoming the preferred partners or the emerging partners in the region. So I think the West has a lot more to worry about, so to speak, geopolitically than Russia. Russia will continue to play that up in whatever way it can. They will remember Africa Day and they will all tweet about it. They will give Russian free lessons. I did A1 Russia by courtesy of the Russian embassy in Kenya. It was for free via Zoom.
That's nice.
And only because I was intrigued because I got tired of trying to beg members of the Russia team to translate things for me. And I just needed to find Mali and CAR in posts and, sort out my life. But that's the sort of thing that they are doing. And because it's playing out on social media, sometimes it feels a bit hyperbolic. The West is still seen as a benchmark for many things. We watch more Hollywood films and Hollywood series. I have Netflix, and that's what most people will have. In fact, the moment Netflix was open to the rest of Africa, every one of us was rushing to subscribe to it, right? And even if RT, for instance, is trying to build a media footprint in the region, it may not have the same resonance as, say, CNN or BBC, because those are known as trustworthy sources because of not just, them being in the West, but because they've had a long time of operating. So it really depends on how you look at it. Diplomatically, yes, if you're in the UN, they've been able to really upset Western dominance, the UN Security Council and the UN plenary itself. But in terms of other things like culture, music, language, I think there will still be a lot more of French, English, German, Arabic in places than there would be Russian for now.
So how much of your brain are you now going to devote to worrying about what Russia is up to in Africa, along with everything else?
Yeah, good question. I think I need an extra brain for all the worry at the moment.
That would be a great European tech innovation. Somebody work on that. Honestly, I feel like I'm going to worry about it a little bit less because I now feel like I understand it a bit better.
Yeah.
It feels like a worrying thing that I understand, which is better than a worrying thing that I don't understand. So thank you so much to Beverly for that really enlightening conversation. Beverly is a fantastic person to follow on social media if you are interested in African politics and especially Russia in Africa, including she's on one of those European alternative social media platforms I mentioned in Bad Week, Mastodon, where we are also present. You can find her at Beverly_Ochieng.
Time to enter the inspiration station and find out what cultural goodies we've got to share from Europe.
Yeah, what have you been enjoying over the past week or so?
Well, I wanted to talk about a board game that I recently started playing again. It's called Codenames. I think you know it, right?
Yeah. I have played it. I can't quite remember what the deal is, but I remember enjoying it.
Well, yeah, and the reason why I'm mentioning it here is because it was invented by a pretty famous Czech game designer called Wagner Group. And I hate describing games, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, but it's essentially a word game, a game where you have to try and find patterns between a random selection of words, and you have to communicate those patterns somehow with your team members. It's a terrible description, but I promise you it's a really fun game.
I was going to say, like, you're not jogging my memory at all. Like, what was this game again?
And it's really fun, despite the fact that I'm actually really bad at it. I lose almost every time. And the fact that I still love it is a sign of how fun the game is, because I usually only like things that I'm good at. It's called Codenames. Go get it from your local gaming store.
Nice. Nice to have a games recommendation.
What have you been enjoying, Katie?
I've got a quite nerdy one for you this week in honor of International Women's Day last weekend. And it is the Economist's Glass Ceiling Index. It's quite a cool interactive page of the Economist's website where you can peruse a ton of data about where in the world is the best place to be a working woman. Can you guess which country came top this year?
Sweden?
It was indeed Sweden.
Oh.
Iceland came top the last 2 years, but they have lost their crown. I do suspect Iceland might come top again next year because the whole country seems to be being run by women at the moment. And the level of political representation of women is one of the factors that makes up how well your country scores. Along with stuff like what percentage of women are part of the labour force, how big the pay gap is between men and women, of course, the percentage of manager-level jobs that are made up by women, and stuff around the affordability of childcare and how generous the parental leave is. I was quite proud to see my own country of France coming in 5th. It is the best non-Nordic country in the world in which to be a working woman, apparently, which I was pleased about, but also quite surprised by, because France seems to have scored kind of medium for a lot of these factors. The one thing it seems to be really good at is having women in the boardroom, which is because we have legal quotas on this in France. Anyway, this whole website, I think, makes a really interesting reading. And there are lots of little graphs with kind of drop-down menus that make it easy to see how your particular country scores on one thing or another. You should check it out. I will put a link in the show notes. You do need to register for a free account to read it, but I would say it's worth it.
This week's happy ending is actually kind of good news for you, Katie, and your baby, seeing as you've just got back from London, I believe, right?
I have, yeah.
And well, the good news is you were breathing cleaner air than you would have a few years ago.
Oh.
That's according to a new study from the Greater London Authority, verified by independent experts, that shows the expansion of London's ultra-low emission zone has led to significantly improved air quality in London. The study claims that London's air quality is actually improving faster than areas outside London, which is quite extraordinary when you think about the concentration of people living in those 600 or 700 square miles. I'll give you a few of the headline statistics. There's been a 27% reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels since the scheme began in 2019. In outer London specifically, where the ultra-low emission zone has recently expanded, the small particle emissions are 31% lower than they would have been had the ultra-low emission zone not expanded in 2023. So, yeah, that's just two of many good statistical indicators for Londoners in this report. And I think this report can be seen as good news for many cities across Europe, where increasingly low emission zones are cropping up, whereby certain vehicles cannot enter cities or parts of cities as a way of reducing pollution. These low emission zones are not always popular with everyone. The expansion of the ultra low emission zone in London was actually incredibly controversial and had protesters vandalizing enforcement cameras and people protesting in the streets. But this report shows that it's worth it, that millions of Londoners have been breathing better air as a result of the policy, and that people, as a result, will be getting less sick. Hurrah.
Do you know what? My baby started coughing immediately when we got back to Paris, and I thought it was just coincidence and he got a bug, but maybe it's an air thing.
Oh, maybe it's an
Gross.
air thing.
Huh.
Dirty Parisian air.
Well, I mean, we do have our own low emission zone here in Paris and a bunch of other stuff. So it is cleaner than it used to be by far, but still work to do apparently.
That's all we've got time for this week, but we will be back next week in your feeds on Thursday. Make sure to look for us, even if Spotify doesn't show you that we're there.
Needy. Also, don't forget to check out the full interview with Beverly on our YouTube channel. It is well worth your time. And you can also check out our Instagram account where there is a very cute new picture announcing, that change that we talked about. The new baby. It does look like Katz and I are the parents of this new baby, but it's a cute picture.
We recreated a photo from last time you made a pregnancy
Yeah.
announcement, which feels kind of cute and stupid at the same time.
Go and check it out. It's on Instagram. We're also on Blue Sky. Just type in Europeans Podcast and you'll find us.
Thanks to our producers this week, Morgan Childs and Wojciech Oleksiak. See you all next week. Bye.
Moika!